Mount Sinai is a really key point in Israel history because they go there and they receive the law from God, and that's when God establishes them as his people. Israel was represented symbolically as the olive tree, and that tree represented its covenant relationship with God. So the Lord takes him, calls him, and he responds and goes and leaves with his family and takes everything that he had to Canaan. Abraham is passing, he's traveling through the land of Canaan, and the Lord's speaking to him. He's saying, I will have this land for your offspring will be here. And I don't know if we all in our current day lives have an Isaac in our lives, whether it's money, whether it's a relationship, whether it's a job that we all have an Isaac in our life. And we have to make sure that we are willing to give it up to God and say, Lord, if you want to use this for whatever your will be done, use it. Welcome, ITB family, to Inside the Bible Podcast, episode 4. Who are the Israelites? And I think that's a question that's so important for us in order to understand the Bible, why God used and chose the people of Israel as the people to help bring in the Messiah. And it's important understanding the Bible, why it was written, who it was written to, and understanding so many different nuggets of the Bible. If we don't understand the Israelites, we're going to be very confused about what is being specifically written and when they're being referred. Why are they being referred? What's the importance of it? And so that's what this episode is on. It's understanding who are the Israelites and why are they so important and why were they God's people? I think firstly, before we get into understanding the beginning of the Israelites, I get all my information about the history of the Israel people through the Bible. The reason why I believe the Bible is specifically reliable for understanding historically the people of Israel is, number one, there's over 25,000 manuscripts about the Bible. That's a lot of evidence. The Bible is one of the most proven books in history. You know, a lot of people take jabs at the Bible, but if you're going to take a jab at the Bible for having 25,000 manuscripts, why don't we look at Aristotle that has 49 manuscripts? And we take that as historically accurate. So when we see the Bible has over 25,000 manuscripts, that's something that's very important in understanding the historical reliability of the Bible and the history of the Bible as well. So let's get into it. The origin of the Israelites, God's chosen people. We understand with Adam and Eve, sin came into the world. We have Cain and Abel. Our first murder is committed on the earth. Then we see Noah. This is generations down. I'm just kind of laying the foundation for what's happening. Noah builds a boat. God floods the earth. Generations pass. The earth is starting to populate. The Tower of Babylon comes into play. Everybody's trying to come together, and the Lord called man to go and spread out. But Tower of Babel, everybody came together and was conspiring to glorify themselves rather than glorify God. So God causes everyone to have a different type of dialect, different type of language that they can't understand. So everyone scatters. And then a couple generations down the road, we get to Abraham. And we see in Genesis chapter 12, he is called by God in Genesis chapter 12. So Abraham is called by God in Genesis chapter 12. The Lord says, go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you, and I will bless your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless those, curse you as you curse you, and all the people on the earth will be blessed through you. So Abraham went as the Lord told him. Abraham was 75 years old when he left Haran and took his wife and his nephew and all the possessions that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. So the Lord takes him, calls him, and he responds and goes and leaves with his family and takes everything that he had to Canaan. Abraham is passing, he's traveling through the land of Canaan, and the Lord's speaking to him. He's saying, I will have this land for your offspring will be here. So they travel, they get to Bethel. Abraham makes a altar, a place of worship for the Lord, which is still in Bethel, or it's around Bethel area today. That's a landmark for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. So he goes there. Then a famine causes them to go and leave and go to Egypt, where Abraham is with his wife. And so obviously, before they get there, Abraham's like, look, we have to tell everybody that you're my sister so I don't get killed. She agrees. They go. And so just as Pharaoh and the leaders, they were falling for the lie that Abraham said and saying that she was his sister. The Lord sends plagues down on them, and so they know something's wrong. So they're like, Abram, you got to take your wife and get out of here. So they leave. Also, I've been saying Abraham. His name before God called him was Abram. So Abram is called Abram. Basically, family they're forced to leave out. They go back, and so the Pharaoh at that time gave Abram a lot of possessions, material. So they left there with a whole bunch of shepherds. They were multiplying. The family name was growing. And so when they get back to Bethel, the homeland where Abram was staying at, Lot and Abram's family has increased so much that they can't stay in the same land. The shepherds are arguing. They're trying to do. They don't have that much room to go. And so Abram and Lot meet up. And so Abram's like, look, wherever you want to go, look to the left, look to your right, and choose the land of what you want to go, and I will go the opposite direction. So Lot looks out and he sees the entire plain of Jordan. It's probably very beautiful. It's compared to, the Garden of Eden. Yes, Lot looks out, sees the entire plain of Jordan as far as Zoar. That was well watered like the Lord's garden, and the land of Egypt. This was before God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose the entire plain of Jordan for himself. He takes his possession, his family, and he goes to the plain of Jordan. And they do a mix of living in Sodom and Gomorrah, and then they're living around the area where Sodom and Gomorrah are. And then immediately after Lot leaves, the Lord approaches Abram again and says, "Look from the place where you are. Look north, south, east, and west. Look in every direction." And the Lord says, "For I will give you and your offspring forever all the land that you see. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth. If anyone could count the dust of the earth, then your offspring could be counted. Get up and walk around the land through its length and width, for I will give it to you." So Abram moved his tent and went to live near the oaks of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. So we see here God makes another promise to Abram, which is you will have all of this area surrounding you. Then we get to 15, obviously 14. Then we get to 15, where Abraham and God officially make a covenant. And this is where the covenant that lasts with them from Abraham all the way to Jesus. That is a covenant that will never be broken. So we see here Abraham saying, like, "Lord, I don't have any children. How am I supposed to have an offspring?" The Lord promises him to have a lineage. And then the Lord said in verse 9, he said to him, "Bring me a 3-year-old cow, a 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a pigeon." So he brought all these things. He cut them in half, but he did not cut the birds in half. As the sun was setting, a deep sleep came over Abram in verse 12, and suddenly great terror and darkness descended on him. Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Know this for certain, your offspring will be resident aliens for 400 years in a land that does not belong to them, and will be enslaved and oppressed. However, I will judge the nation they serve, and afterward they will go out with many possessions. But you will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age." Verse 17, when the sun had set and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch appeared and passed between the divided animals. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, "I will give this land to your offspring from the brook of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates River." And so what we see here is when we're talking about that light that walked through the halves of the animals, walked through it, that represented the eternal covenant that God made with Abram. Abram didn't have to walk through. Usually both parties would walk through the covenant in order to make that covenant. But God said, "I'm going to be the one that will make this covenant, because this covenant will never fail. This covenant will never break. And it's a covenant that would last forever." So the covenant is made. Abraham is visited by 3 visitors in chapter 18, where, he's promised again that he's going to have a son, and that their lineage is going to be numerous as the stars, as the sand. We obviously know Sarah does laugh when she hears about this. In her mind, she laughs because she's very old at this time. Yeah, man. Genesis 18 verses 11. Abraham and Sarah were old and getting on in years. Sarah had passed the age of childbearing, so she laughed to herself. "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I have delight?" But the Lord asked Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh, saying, 'Can I really have a baby when I'm old?' Is anything impossible for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will come back to you, and in about a year she will have a son." Sarah denied it. "I did not laugh," she said, because she was afraid. But he replied, "No, you did laugh." And that's one of those, funny little things where we, like try to play a game with God. Like, I didn't say that. I didn't say it, but you did. You did. And so after that, we see Abraham pleads for Sodom and Gomorrah, and he pleads for them. We talked about this in the last episode where the Lord, he tries to get this number down with the Lord. Like, if there's 50 righteous, will you destroy it? And God says no. 40? No. 30? No. 20? No. 10? No. And then we see here that, the Lord judges Sodom and Gomorrah and understands that there's not even 10 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah. So he destroys it. An angel of the Lord came to Lot and his family, and so they try to leave the city. But his wife turned around to look. They were commanded not to turn around, or else they'd be turned to salt, a pillar of salt. And his wife turns around, she turns into a pillar of salt, and they flee. We go down, and we see now that Abraham has a son, just as the Lord said he would. He would have a son, named him Isaac. Now Isaac is born in chapter 21, verses 22. He's I know Abraham at this point is so, happy that he's having a child. He was child. They were able to have children. You see that the Lord tests Abraham here. So now that he has his everything, his son is his everything. So the Lord says, I'm going to test you to see if you are truly faithful to me. So he's woken up after these things got tested him, said, Abraham, he said, here I am. In verse 2, take your son, your only son, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. So we see here that, the Lord is testing Abraham here. He never wanted children to be sacrificed, but he had to test them with the thing that he loved most in the world. And I don't know if we ought in our current day lives have an Isaac in our lives, whether it's money, whether it's a relationship, whether it's a job that we all have an Isaac in our life. And we have to make sure that we are willing to give it up to God and say, Lord, if you want to use this for whatever your will be done, use it. Because if not, then we'll lose track of what our relationship with God is and where our priorities are. I think it's interesting. Let's just take a look at it. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place at the distance. And Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship, and then we will come back to you. So Abraham still has the faith in believing that his son will still be brought back. I don't know what that means. When we look at the biblical text in verse 5, Abraham is confident that his son will come back with him. Verse 7, then Isaac spoke to his father Abraham and said, my father, here I am. He said, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. And the two of them walked together. When they arrived at the place, Abraham reached out and took his knife to slaughter his son after putting him on the sacrifice. But the angel of the Lord called him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. He answered, here I am. Then he said, do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me. And so these are one of the things where, and then Abraham saw a ram caught in a thicket by its thorns. So Abraham went out and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in the place of his son. So we see a redemptive tone take place where the Lord was going to provide a sacrifice so Isaac wouldn't have to die. In the same way, Jesus Christ took on the sins, he took on our transgressions when we should have been the ones up there on that cross dying. He said, I will take their place and I will die for their sins. And it's interesting the language we see here. God says, Abraham, take the son, your own beloved son, which you love, and sacrifice him. And he doesn't make him go through with that, but God loved his son so much, and he still allowed him to be sacrificed for the sins of the world. So Isaac isn't sacrificed. We see he gets married, has kids, and Jacob and Esau. And so we see it's interesting here. If we look at Genesis 25, we see the birth of Isaac's sons, Jacob and Esau. And so we see here when his wife's time came to give birth, they were twins. The first one came out red looking, covered with hair like a fur coat, and they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out grasping at Esau's heel with his hand, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when they were born. And we see here, there were the names that they had, the Hebrew names were they were important. Like Esau was like hairy. It had something to do with hairy, so that's why they called him Esau. And then Jacob was called Jacob because that name in the Hebrew means like a trickster, which is, very ironic for what happens later on. But we see when the boys grew, Jacob wasn't the oldest, so he didn't have the oldest blessing. Esau is a big hunter. Jacob's, very much around the house, just hanging out. Jacob was cooking a stew, and Esau came from the field, said he was exhausted and hungry. And so Jacob, it's interesting here. Jacob asks him to sell his birthright to him for the food. And so Esau said, I'm about to die. So what good is a birthright to me? So we see Esau, even though Jacob tricks Esau, we see Esau forsook his birthright. He didn't care about it. He could have cared less. So he said, my birthright is the amount of what this stew is worth. And he didn't understand what God was doing and how God was working. So he forsake his birthright and gave it to Jacob. So we see in 27, when Isaac is about to pass, his eyes are weak, he could not see. He calls basically for his oldest son to come in so he could be blessed. But Jacob puts on some, hairy clothes to make it seem like he is Esau, steals his blessing. He's on the run now. His brother's upset. His brother wants to basically kill him because he took his birthright. But really, Esau forsook his birthright. So Jacob inherited the blessing from the father. He inherited the blessing. He gets married. He flees, gets married. And he's getting ready to meet Esau again. We see that in chapter 33. After there's like a few detailed stuff that the Bible goes into with his life. But we see he's about to get ready to meet Esau again. Now Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming toward him with 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the two slave women. He's trying to prepare for if they're going to kill him. But before we get to him meeting Esau, we look back the night before when Jacob is wrestling with God. He's wrestling with God. And so I think, we look at it as actual wrestling, but it just illustrates the struggle for blessing and the importance of having that personal relationship with God. And it's very much a symbolic thing rather than a literal, I'm fighting God type of deal. And seeking God in that way will really lead to spiritual growth and maturity. So we see he's wrestling with God. His name is changed. Israel in verse 28 of 32. He says, your name will no longer be Jacob. He said, it will be Israel because you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed. So it's one of those things where the angel of the Lord was literally, he couldn't stop Jacob, even though he took, it says the angel put the hand on Jacob's rib and he made his rib go out of socket, but he still wouldn't give up for the blessing and the intimacy he had with God. He wouldn't let that go. He gets up, meets with Esau. He basically, and it says in verse 31, the sun shone on him as he passed by Penuel, limping because of his hip. That is why still today the Israelites don't eat the thigh muscle that is at the hip socket, because he struck Jacob's hip socket at the thigh muscle. So the next day he's meeting Esau, in verse 4, but Esau ran to him, hugged him, threw his arms around him and kissed him, and then they wept. So we see, they reconcile, reconciliation comes into place, understands that the Lord's at work. And then we get to Jacob and his sons, or Israel and his sons now. So Israel has 12 sons, which represent the 12 tribes of Israel. So Jacob has 12 sons, and this is when we're getting into the time where, the story of Joseph. I'm sure most people are familiar with the story of Joseph. And so we see he really loves Joseph so much more than his brothers, because Joseph was born from his most beloved wife, Rachel. And so that's why also I believe, the Bible isn't affirming polygamy. It isn't affirming these things, but we see the consequences of polygamy with jealousy, hatred, and we see all these things. But the Lord, same way with slavery, the Lord is slowly trying to get them away from this understanding of polygamy. And so, 12 sons, the 12th son is the firstborn of his most beloved wife, creates jealousy. The brothers sell him into slavery. At first they wanted to kill him, but then he was sold into slavery. And so he's going through this motion of God, why is this happening to me? Why? And so the Lord, is faithful. He's sold into slavery. He goes up the ranks. He's taken he's Potiphar's second in command of his house. He's doing these great things. He's tempted by Potiphar's wife. He refuses. He's framed for it. And I think it's one of those things too, especially if basically that's a death sentence. If he really the Egyptians were ruthless. If a Hebrew slave would have gone in there and done something like that to an official, and all he did was throw him in prison, that was was seen as abnormal because that they would have had him killed. So I believe Potiphar knew that Joseph didn't do it, but he needed to get him out of the way of his wife. So he's in jail. We understand the story with the dreams. He interprets the dreams. He um, he tells the people that he interpreted the dream of in prison when they get out and they're back in their positions of power just to remember him. Or the one guy, he'd see the other guy died. The one guy that he said would get out, he said, just remember me when you get out. And he basically fails to remember that. And then, time comes where, Pharaoh had a dream. He was troubled by it, called for all of his magi to come and help and interpret the dream. The cupbearers there realizes that he's made a big mistake. He forgot to mention Joseph to the Pharaoh. He's brought in, he interprets the dream, talking about famine. And so he's brought up as the second, like basically the second most in command of Egypt in its entirety. So he's exalted, he's in this position of power. His brothers come, at first they didn't recognize him, but he reveals his identity. They embrace each other, they bring everything. So basically then his father, Jacob, which is Israel, comes and they bring all of their belongings to Egypt and they settle down in Egypt. And then a couple hundred years pass and we see something interesting that happens. All of Joseph dies, his entire generation dies, the next generation dies, the next generation dies, and everybody forgets about who this Joseph character was and what he did for Egypt. And so then we move into Exodus, which is the next book, Exodus, where the new Pharaoh's like, who are these people? Why there's so many of them? They're so fruitful. We don't know who they are. They could revolt for all we know. So let's enslave them and have them do forced work. So they're doing forced labor. Moses is born. We know the story of Moses. I want to keep this brief because I know we have a time crunch. Moses is born, he's supposed to be killed, but he evades death by his mother who loves him so much. He stays alive. He's received into the Pharaoh's daughter's hands. She raises him up. And so, we see Moses, God uses Moses in a way to be the liberator for Israel. He uses them to be the liberator of Israel. And we see that. And then we go from there to the plagues. Then we go from the plagues to freedom. Pharaoh's like, you guys leave, go ahead and leave. He kicks them out, basically. They're in high hopes. And then something switches in Pharaoh's mind and he goes to kill them. But God parts the sea for them to walk through the Red Sea and then closes it on top of the, Pharaoh's army. And then we see everything's going great. Everyone's praising God. They're doing all these things. And then they start wandering. They have to go through on this journey to Mount Sinai. And so Mount Sinai is a really key point in Israel history because they go there and they receive the law from God. And that's when God establishes them as his people. And so we see they're still wandering. They're also doubting at the same time too. It gets to the point where they're complaining about where are we going to get food? Where are we going to get water? This journey that they're making. And then we see a little bit of most of Leviticus is about the law of conduct. The Lord was establishing their conduct, and a little bit of Numbers is just how they should go about doing things to set themselves apart from the other nations. You see in Numbers chapters 13, this is where God is trying to get them into the land that they were promised, the land of Canaan. So in Numbers chapter 13, scouting out Canaan, there's a list of 12 guys that were sent, 12 spies that were sent to scout out the land. And the two that you need to be remember is, so to Caleb and Joshua. Caleb and Joshua were two of the spies that were sent out to scout out the land out of the spies that were sent out. And so they go out, they scout, they come back. And so they reported to Moses, we went into the land where you sent us. Indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey, and here is some of the fruit. However, the people living in the land are strong, and the cities are large and fortified. We also saw the descendants of Anak there. Then Caleb quieted the people in the presence of Moses. They're starting to panic, saying, how can we go in there, And so Caleb quiets the people and says, let's go up now and take possession of the land because we can certainly conquer it. But the men who had gone up with them responded, we can't attack the people because they are stronger than we are. So they gave a negative report to the Israelites about the land they had scouted. The whole community wept, loud cries, and people wept all night. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to die by sword? Our wives and children will become plunder. Why wouldn't wasn't it better for us to go back to Egypt? So they're doubting the promise that God made with them at Mount Sinai and the promise that God made with them with Moses and Abraham. Joshua son of Nun and Caleb son of Jephunneh, who were among those who scouted the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite community, "The land we passed through and explored is extremely good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will bring us into this land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and give it to us. Only don't rebel against the Lord and don't be afraid of the people of the land, for we will devour them. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them." And while the whole community threatened to stone them, the glory of the Lord appeared to all the Israelites and the tent of meeting. And so we see here that the Lord says, because then the Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people despise me? How long will they not trust in me, despite all the signs that I performed among them?" And so this is where God says, okay, since you guys are refusing to go in the land, this generation will have to pass on before they can go into the next. And that's when Joshua and Caleb are the only people from that generation that will lead them into that land. And so we see a shift. So the generation passes. They go in. Now they're getting ready to go into the land. Joshua leads them in, conquests big cities like Ai. Jericho was the stronghold of the Canaanites that he destroyed. Gibeon, Hebron, Debir. He takes all these other nations and he's starting to help conquer and get the people of God into the land that was promised to them. And then once Joshua died, and then we go into the judges period of Israel. So basically 12 judges arose and led Israel on and through the work of God, inspiring them and helping them to lead Israel. So they were chosen by God to help Israel defeat its enemies, unite the 12 tribes, and enforce God's law on the people. Go through this, and then they go through the 12 judges. Then Israel demands a king. And this is where it shifts, because they were a theocracy. Now they're turning into a democracy, because they're shifting now from wanting God to be their king to wanting to be like the other nations. And so they get a king. They get King Saul. He's corrupt king. The Lord can't use him. He calls David. David becomes a big reason why they were able to capture the capital of Jerusalem. They took it over, and that's where they resided. So David comes on the scene. He's not perfect. He has his flaws. That brother has some flaws. He, murdered. He, slept with somebody's wife, got them pregnant. And he's called out for his iniquities by a prophet. He repents and the Lord forgives him, but still judges him by taking his son away from him. So we go from there. We go to Solomon. King Solomon, knowledgeable guy. He asked for the Lord to give him knowledge, and he was basically the smartest guy who ever walked the earth, basically. He's going through this. He has a son, and he gets, even though he had all that knowledge, his flesh took over, even though he had all that knowledge. So it doesn't matter. I don't want to take this time to say it doesn't matter how much knowledge you have in the Bible. It doesn't matter how much, time you put into your Bible or how much you think you know things, because same thing with Solomon. He let his fleshly desires get in the way of God. And so when he did that, he started accumulating all this wealth. He started taxing the people heavily. His son started taxing the people heavily. And this caused for there to become a split in Israel. They split to the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. And so from that moment on, we start to see, there's, the Lord judges them, because we get into the cycle of Israel, both nations, basically the same nation, but both parts of Israel, the cycle of sinning and repenting, God sending prophets, they keep on sinning. And so the Lord ends up exiling them, but once he exiles them, he's faithful and says, "You will get out of exile and I will use you to establish the lineage of the Messiah." Later on, after they're in exile for their sins, they're taken back out, they rebuild the temple. And then that's where we get to, a couple centuries later, of course, that's where we get to Jesus, where Jesus comes into play. But throughout the history of Israel, we see three different main themes: covenant. We see that there's a covenant that was made with Abraham. So they call it Abraham. Holiness. God called them to a level of holiness to set themselves apart from the different nations of Israel. And the third thing is faithfulness. He calls them to be faithful to him. He doesn't call them to kind of be wishy-washy with him, but he calls them to full communion, full reverence, and full faithfulness to God and who he is. And then so that's really the history up till we get to Jesus, and then we know about all that. But I just wanted to give this episode as a quick introduction to who the Israelites were. Yeah, and then as we close, I just want to close with 4 things that we need to pay attention to, especially with understanding how we go from Israel to now. And how does that apply to me? If I'm not Jewish, am I under that? If I'm not Israel, if I'm not from the Jewish people or Israel, am I going to get this covenant? How does it apply to me? I'm glad you asked. There's 4 things that I want us to take away from understanding the importance of who the Israelites were and how they're important for us today. So we see number 1, that Israel is the light to the nations. What do I mean by that? In Isaiah 49 verses 4, we see, verse 6. Isaiah's a prophet, and he says, it is enough for you to be my servant, raising up the tribes of Jacob and restoring the protected ones of Israel. I will make you a light for the nations, to be my salvation to the ends of the earth. It quenches the idea that Jesus and God only came for the 12 tribes of Israel. That is not what happened here. God makes it very clear here that he is using Israel as the chosen people in order to be a blessing and be a light to the nations. The second thing I want us to see also is that Israel is the priestly nation of the world. It is the priests to the world. What do I mean by that? Let's look at Exodus 19 verses 5 through 6. Now, if you carefully listen to me and keep my covenant, you will be my own possession out of all the peoples, although the whole earth is mine. And you will be my kingdom of priests and my holy nation. These are the words that you are to say to the Israelites. And so they are the priests, really the people that bring in and usher in God to the world. The third thing we also see too is that Israel is the carriers of the Messiah. We see in Isaiah 11 verse 10, on that day the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nations will look to him for guidance, and his resting place will be glorious. So we see so Jesse was a part of the tribe of Judah. From him, there was someone that was going to come to address the issues and the sins of the world. And then let's talk about finally what that means for us as people who are Gentiles. Basically, we're Gentiles. We're not from the people of Israel. The 4th thing that I want to clarify is that Gentiles are grafted into the olive tree. What does that mean? Israel was represented symbolically as the olive tree, and that tree represented its covenant relationship with God. So how are we put into this olive tree? How does that work for us? So if we look at Romans 11 verses 17 through 24, we see here, it says, Paul's writing here, Romans, he says, now I'm speaking to you Gentiles, insofar as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. In verse 14, if I might somehow make my own people jealous and save some of them, for if their rejection brings reconciliation up to the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? Now, if the first fruits are holy, so is the whole batch. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. Now, if some of the branches were broken off, and you, though a wild olive branch, were grafted in among them, and have come to share in the rich root of the cultivated olive tree, do not boast that you are better than those branches, but if you do boast, you do not sustain the root, but the root sustains you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. True enough, they were broken off because of unbelief, but you stand by faith. Do not be arrogant, but beware, because if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. And so what this is saying is that, that stray olive branches, which are the Gentile nations, the Gentile people, they are invited to take part in the olive tree, which is the covenant of Israel and God. They're invited to join in and be a part of that covenant as well. And I think that's so amazing that God didn't just he didn't pick favorites, but he chose the people to use in order to establish the kingdom, establish the Messiah, and establish Messiah to come in and die for the sins of the whole world so that we might be grafted in to this olive tree and be a part of this amazing relationship. And that us as Gentiles, as people who weren't originally part of that covenant, were brought into the covenant by that bringing in of the grafting of the wild sticks to the olive tree. Yeah, that's all we got for this episode, man. So thankful for you guys to be here. But before I wrap up, I want to end with this. You have the Old Testament, which is the Old Covenant that was primarily used for the people of Israel. The New Covenant that was promised in Jeremiah 31 and fulfilled by Jesus Christ. And in Hebrews 8, it clarifies that this salvation is open to all and that Gentiles are not taking part of this as second-class citizens, but as first-class citizens with the Jewish people through this new covenant through Jesus Christ. So thank you all so much for listening to this podcast, All in a Day's Work. We'll see y'all next time.